Hello, and welcome to my talk. Speaking is a remarkably complex process. Producing even a single word, as in a picture naming task, requires mapping from meaning to words to phonology, and translating that into a set of motor commands that you can incorporate into your breathing functions to generate a specific audible vibration. I'm going to focus on this part, mapping from meanings to words. A major claim that served as the foundation for several decades of language production research is that candidate words non-trivially compete for selection. I don't just mean that speakers need to apply a winner-take-all function, but specifically that having multiple candidates requires a difficult decision process that slows you down. So imagining word retrieval in a network like this, we might implement competitive selection as lateral inhibition between words, or as a relative threshold for the lexical selection rule. Evidence for that claim has come from the picture-word interference paradigm, where superimposed distractors hinder picture naming more when they're from the same taxonomic category as the target than when they refer to unrelated items. Converging evidence for that pattern comes from the continuous naming paradigm, where participants simply name pictures one at a time, like bread, then dog, then cake. They take a bit longer with each successive item from the same taxonomic category. In a similar paradigm, called blocked cyclic naming, participants repeatedly cycle through a small set of items, and the classic finding there is that they get comparatively slower when the items come from the same taxonomic category than when they represent different taxonomic categories. All of these effects are very robust and have been repeatedly claimed as specific evidence for competitive lexical selection. So several decades of research have consistently linked taxonomic relations with interference, and several decades of theories have repeatedly cast that interference as evidence for competitive lexical selection. And again, competitive selection in this sense means specifically that related words slow you down, specifically during this part of the production process. Now, what about another kind of semantic similarity? Items that share a theme, like cake and balloon, both associated with birthday parties. Some have argued that these relations are exactly like taxonomic relations, therefore reinforcing the competitive selection claim. For instance, Abdelrahman and Mellinger, 2007, presented a series of studies where associations that they'd characterized as thematic produced the same interference as taxonomic associations did. That must imply competition, right? But most other production studies disagree with that finding. Ilario Costa, Mann, and colleagues have repeatedly shown that thematic relations produce facilitation in picture-word interference, which they've cast as evidence for a non-competitive lexical selection process, where response times only depend on the target. And back to blocked cyclic naming, it's worth noting that in a 2014 study, Zubikare and colleagues showed intermediate results for thematic associations, neither interference nor facilitation, which again suggests that the effect of thematic associations at least differs from that of taxonomic associations. Now, these apparently contrasting effects are problematic for the field because of their interpretation in terms of selection processes and all of the theory that has been built on that foundation. If interference equals competitive selection and facilitation equals non-competitive selection, then where does this leave us? We'll address two questions here. First, there's the empirical. The effects of taxonomic relations are very robust, but the effects of thematic relations are much less so. So, are the effects of taxonomic and thematic relations on word production actually the same or different? Then there's the theoretical. If these effects really are different, do they imply competitive or non-competitive lexical selection? First, we'll address the empirical question. Previous studies have often confounded taxonomic and thematic associations, making their results difficult to interpret. So we took a quantitative, systematic approach. We quantified taxonomic similarity by using Resnick scores from WordNet. Then we quantified thematic similarity by using measures of lexical co-occurrence in a movie subtitle corpus. And then we orthogonally manipulated these factors as a within-subject, within-item comparison in our block cyclic naming task. So this is the best controlled comparison of these effects in block cyclic naming to date. Compared to the unrelated baseline, people were, of course, slower to name pictures in blocks that contained taxonomically related items, like cow and bear. And when we assessed thematic relations, they were significantly faster than the taxonomic blocks, and even numerically faster than the unrelated. So that's a trend toward the kind of semantic facilitation that has been previously reported for picture-word interference. So now we know that the difference between the taxonomic and thematic effects is real. But does that difference in the effects actually imply different selection mechanisms? That is, do these empirical differences in fact require different selection mechanisms, as researchers have repeatedly claimed, or could they instead be explained by differences between how people represent thematic versus taxonomic associations? We don't have a priori reasons to think that taxonomic and thematic associations should differ in their contributions to selection processes. But we do have good reasons to think that people should represent taxonomic and thematic knowledge differently. For one thing, thematic knowledge is usually thought to depend more on its relevance to a particular context. And for another, thematic knowledge is a fundamentally relational concept, based on co-occurrence. When it becomes relevant, it typically remains relevant not just for a single word, but for a larger segment of discourse. We therefore assume that lexical semantic networks contain a mixture of relatively context-invariant features, like these, which might broadly map onto taxonomic distinctions, and more context-dependent features that contribute more when they become relevant in a broader interaction. We implement both types of features in our model. Two orthogonal banks of context-invariant features, and then a third orthogonal set of features that contribute more in supporting contexts and less in irrelevant contexts. I'm happy to talk more about this later, and you can check out our paper for more details about how we implemented that distinction for these simulations. We also simulate two selection rules, and again, I'm happy to discuss them later, or you can look at our paper for more details. The important thing to note about these selection rules is that the competitive rule implements a relative threshold, while the non-competitive rule implements an absolute threshold. Now we'll assess the contributions of these factors within the framework of a simple feed-forward model that I've used previously. Here we're using the architectures and selection rules that I've just described. It's a simple feed-forward model or network that learns from each trial, and we test it on the same block cyclic naming task that I've just shown you. An important feature of this model is the incremental learning process that continues throughout its life. So now I'll show you how that works. Start by assuming that the model is trying to retrieve the word cake, so it activates relevant semantic features like sweet and wheaty, which in turn activate cake and bread with some amount of error. Then the learning process adjusts the connection weights to reduce error in the next attempt. Cake is marked as correct, bread as incorrect, so we strengthen the connections that supported cake and weaken those that erroneously activated bread. So if the model needs to name bread next, it will be a little less activated than it would have been otherwise. First, we'll focus on cumulative semantic interference in our simulations, as we would usually see this from taxonomic relations. So we'll test this first by just focusing on the context invariant features. Remember that interference in this task has been claimed as evidence for a competitive selection rule, and the model with the competitive selection rule simulates the effect quite nicely. Items in real context take longer to name than items in unrelated contexts. But what about the model with the noncompetitive selection rule? The same effect. So contrary to previous claims, this interference effect does not require competition. Instead, the key to this effect lies in the incremental learning process. When the network encounters cake after bread, it has to depend on connections that it had just adjusted to avoid cake. So cake is a little less activated, meaning that it'll take longer to retrieve even without competition in the selection algorithm. Now what about thematic facilitation, which we'll test by engaging the context-dependent features? We'll start with the noncompetitive selection model, because facilitation has been claimed as support for that. And in fact, noncompetitive selection generates the thematic facilitation effect quite nicely. You see that in this case, thematically related blocks take longer than unrelated or taxonomically related blocks. But does that actually mean that thematic facilitation specifically requires the noncompetitive selection rule? In fact, it does not. Again, we see the same pattern regardless of the selection rule. Here, the key to semantic facilitation with either selection rule is the theme node's greater dependency on a supporting context. The taxonomic features alone are sufficient to retrieve cake, but in a supporting context, the theme node provides an extra retrieval queue, and even with a strongly competitive selection algorithm, that extra queue provides a net benefit. What's more, we've captured taxonomic interference and thematic facilitation in the same model, with each selection mechanism just by implementing two commonly held assumptions. First, that people learn when they do things, implicit learning. And second, that the engagement of thematic representations depends on a supporting context. So what do these effects tell us about lexical selection processes? Well, the empirical contrast between taxonomic interference and thematic facilitation is real, but despite decades of claims to the contrary, these contrasting effects do not actually imply specific or contrasting selection mechanisms. Overlap in context-invariant features produces semantic interference through incremental learning that includes on-learning. Representing themes as context-dependent features produces theme-based facilitation, because theme-relevant contexts provide additional retrieval cues. But neither effect is noticeably modulated by the presence or absence of competition in the selection algorithm. So with that, we can conclude that representation matters, selection not so much. Thank you.